Way back in the 1960s, um, ours was a very young congregation, had just formed, and my wife and I joined. We were ourselves, shortly after marriage, and there was a Civil Rights Council forming. This is a time of school integration and all kinds of civil rights activities. Um, So I went to that Civil Rights Council meeting on behalf of my congregation. I came back and I recommended that we participate. Um, we did, and I became the representative of our congregation. Before too long, the congregations themselves were not so deeply involved. Most of the people who actually showed up and were there. Um, and the Civil Rights Council, after a few years, got involved in the local school desegregation case. Somebody from the congregation, I solicited them, and they became people who sued the school system because they had children in the school system, and they said that segregation needed to be corrected. So we got close to them. Their name is Fisher, Goldie Fisher, and Henry Fisher. Well, school segregation went ahead, and we won the case here in Columbus, and segregation was going on. We wanted to make it countywide, and we didn't succeed in that. We called in the NAACP from New York because we needed their help. That's how we succeeded, finally. And then the congregation moved on. We went to moved out into Worthington. The Fishers lived out east, and they didn't come with the congregation. They joined Tiferet Israel on Broad Street here. And then one day I hear much more recently, not that recent, I would say maybe about 10 years ago, called me, and we were still friendly, and they said there's this organization, the Bread Organization, and there's a meeting going on that's going to be a Nehemiah Action meeting, and they invited us to come. So we went, and they brought us into the Bread Organization, and they wanted some investment in bread, and we made that. And then it became obvious that really our congregation, with the history that we've had in civil rights, Beth Tikva, should be joining. And I brought this up to the board of trustees, and the president was behind me, was supportive, and ever since that time we joined the Bread Organization. So that's the answer of how we got involved. Why? I think there are a lot of things wrong in society, not just in this country, all over the place, that need correcting. And if people just sit back and let things happen, they're going to go on, going to follow the easiest way. And there's not going to be a change, and not going to be any improvement. People who suffer are going to continue to suffer. People who are neglected are going to continue to be neglected. The only way something happens is if you get behind an organization such as Bread, and that Bread's very welcome because by yourself an individual can't achieve much. So doing it by way of joining Bread was the obvious solution, and I always believed in showing up. That's a big part of winning battles, is you got to show up, you got to be there. The other reason is that my background is that I was born in Germany right around the time of when Hitler came to power. We were Jewish. My parents tried to get out and find a way out, and everything was locked. There was no way out. We had family in America who sent us affidavits and so on. That wasn't good enough. American law, it's kind of complicated, and I'm not going to go into it, but there was not going to be a permit to get out of Germany for years and years and years. And things got worse, and it got closer and closer. And in fact, the Second World War started, and we were still in Germany. It was quite obvious that that was life-threatening. So my father found an old friend from way back in Switzerland, where he had lived and worked, and he made contact again with that friend of his. He's not Jewish, and it's been a long time since I had talked to him, but he explained that we had this need. And I was around 6 years old perhaps at the time, and he said, look, he needs to find a way out for his family. This friend, you know, after a long time of absence, was there for us. He looked around and he found somebody among the Swiss border guards. There was somebody who was prepared to let us in, even though the Swiss government wasn't going to give us a permit. He did so because he understood the human need. And even though as a border guard, he was derelict of duty, he was supposed to keep us out, we didn't have a permit. He understood the need, and he was there. Total stranger. To this day, I don't know his name. I think I'm only here because that man showed up when he was asked. And my father's friend showed up and found somebody to help. So individuals can make a real difference. I know other cases, again, where individuals have made a difference, and that's been sort of a whole life's orientation. And that what brings me to bread. It's simply the most natural thing in the world. I think we've dealt with issue 1. Why is your involvement in bread or your congregation's justice ministry important to you? Well, aside from my personal experience and orientation, as I pointed out, religion teaches an awful lot of different things about God, about what's right and wrong, and so on and so forth. All of these things are important, but I think it all blanches unless we're concerned with what goes on in our community. If we don't concern ourselves with things that are going wrong in our community and simply sit back and keep coming to services once a week, that's a cop-out. And it's an abandonment of the principles that our religions teach us. And I think it makes no difference if it's Judaism or Christianity in all its different forms. There's a common denominator. We are told by our religion to be concerned with our fellow human being. And of course we need to be concerned immediately with our family and then with our larger community around us. But we got to be concerned especially in the political system is such that we have responsibilities in our city, in our county, and the state. So that's the beauty of living in a democracy, but democracy doesn't go anywhere and doesn't help us unless we make use of what democracy offers, and that is a voice. I think it's a betrayal of religious principles to go to services on a regular basis and not to be involved in concerns about community justice. Excuse me. So it's a natural. I think that answers my question number 2. There's simply no other way. Would you describe the first Nehemiah action that I attended, and what was it, and I don't remember. Actually, the first Nehemiah action is before Congregation of Tikva joined bread. I had been invited by the Fishers, and I went to that. And I remember that a woman who was running for Congress at the time, Kilpatrick, gosh, I can't think of her name now. She was invited to speak and to make some kind of a commitment at that meeting. And excuse me, the meeting was pretty self-explanatory. There were some issues, we were trying to deal with them, and some of her colleagues didn't want to make a commitment. And typically for bread, we were very insistent. We didn't take no for an answer very easily. And this woman who, as time went on, I actually helped her with her political career. I helped her in getting votes and in the elections. But the first I knew about her is when she stood up there on the stage and started taking the microphone and started speaking out about what she was telling us what we were doing wrong, and she knew better. She had 5 minutes, and she was hijacking our meeting, and people started calling for her to sit down. She didn't respond, and finally people started to applaud and sort of forced her to sit down. Even years later, when I worked with her, she still remembered that and what a terrible mistake we all made, and didn't listen to her much greater judgment. So I remember that. It's a case where clearly the invited official, in my view, was very badly at fault. So I remember that distinctly, and something that sticks in my mind and will always be there. On the other hand, we also have more recent confrontations where I think maybe we didn't handle it properly. You got to be very careful. Confrontation in that arena sometimes is required, necessary, and we got to stand our ground. But at other times, we may be shooting ourselves in the foot. If you actually have somebody who, in principle, is in our corner, but has some minor objection, and if we stand our ground without thinking through what that means, as I said, we may be shooting us in the foot. So doing that job is not easy. It's done by volunteers. They're not professionals who know how to think on their feet when they confront a politician who is giving them a hard time. And in that particular case, we didn't make the right decision. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the need to stand our ground and when to do it, and what alternatives we have. So it's a job, and Brett needs to keep growing in that direction. I think we're not doing such a bad job. That, I think, takes care of 2, doesn't it? 3. No, that's 3. 4. What was the most exciting part about this year's Nehemiah Action, and why? I thought this year's Nehemiah Action, incidentally, did you have a chance to be there?
I didn't.
Uh-huh.
I did not.
Okay. It was probably one of the best organized ones. People were really well prepared for it. Generally, the questions were well thought out. There was a problem here and there. One of the people who we had invited, who came and who was very supportive and continues to be supportive of our activities, he's a professor at the university, and he himself wrote up the question and the answer he was going to give. And being in academia, it was that kind of a response, and it was lengthy, and it didn't communicate to the group, because we have 2,500 people there. He didn't really connect with them. Again, it's something for us to learn. Even when people are with you and are cooperative, you gotta look carefully to make sure that it's really effective. Other than a little stumble like that, it was a very effective meeting. Not everybody that we asked to make commitments gave us simple, straightforward yes answers. But we had learned to live with it, and we found a way of insisting on what we wanted to do and allowing them the space to say, yes, they'll work with us, and they'll have to decide, and have to see how they're going to be able to meet the demands that we're making. I think it was the right way to do it. I think we learned something from previous years. The audience was very responsive. At 2,540 people, I think, that we brought out. It's not the highest turnout we ever had. It's the highest in the last 3 or 4 years. So we're on the way up again, and that was good too. Specifically, West Tikva didn't do that well. We had 50 some people, 55 people, and that's down from the typical 70 to 75 people we've had. One time we had 98. That was an unusual turnout. I still like to see us get back to that level, but it takes a lot of work. And we just now we're in the process of getting organized to try and have a comeback as a congregation and help out for the next year's Nehemiah Action. I think that those are the answers to these questions, unless you have some other thoughts of things we should be dealing with.